Welcome to this session with Professor Helen Jarvie, Principal Scientist of Hydrochemistry at the Center for Ecology and Hydrology, CEH, in Wallingford, which is in the UK, a wonderful market town on the Thames River between Oxford and Reading in the county, I think, of Oxfordshire.
It is, yes.
A very well-renowned research center. Dr. Jarvie has been there for over 24 years. She has a PhD from the University of Reading, so not very far away, in fluvial sedimentology and geochemistry. And as I mentioned, she's been there for almost 25 years now. Center for Ecology and Hydrology is a world-renowned research organization focusing on land and freshwater ecosystems and their interaction with the atmosphere. And a very well-known institute also because of its role in the implementation of the European Water Framework Directive since 2000. Led by Professor Mark Bailey, who's also on the scientific advisory board, as well as some of our Water Institute members of the Chinese Research Academy of Environmental Sciences. So there are some connections with CEH there. Dr. Jarvie is highly prolific and highly cited as a scientist with more than 130 international publications. And in 2011-2012, she won the prestigious Fulbright Fellowship to work on a nutrient buffering capacity of rivers and streams at the University of Arkansas in the US, where she has been a visiting adjunct professor in fluvial sciences ever since. She's also a visiting professor in environmental chemistry at Plymouth University in the UK, and a visiting professor in water quality sciences at the University of Tokyo in Japan. Between 2013 and 2017, she was appointed by the British Consulate General to the United States National Science Foundation Sustainable Phosphorus Research Coordination Network, and last year she was appointed for 5 years on the International Scientific Advisory Council of the Leibniz Science Campus in Germany. Helen is not a stranger to Canada. Earlier this year, in January, she received the Journal of Environmental Quality Best Paper Award for her work in an international collaboration, including US and Canadian scientists, in evaluating the drivers of increased river Pfluxes to Lake Erie. And today she will deliver a lecture on river system biochemistry with particular emphasis on nutrient cycling and water quality from watershed to global perspectives. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jarvie to the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Roy, for those kind words. It is indeed a very great pleasure to be here at the Water Institute to talk with you today. So, as Roy said, I'm a water quality scientist, a biogeochemist, and my research interests really focus on nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus in river systems. Of course, a major cause of eutrophication, excessive nuisance, algal growth, and the ecological impairment that brings to our water bodies. And my research explores the drivers of eutrophication from local to global scales. And today I want to give you a flavour of some of the research that I've been doing over the last few years on nutrients, water quality and water security from catchment to global perspectives. Well, the first thing to say is that we're totally reliant on nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. We can't grow our food without them. But unlike nitrogen, which we can harness from the atmosphere by the Haber-Bosch process to produce nitrogen fertilizers, for phosphorus we're absolutely dependent on non-renewable phosphate rock resources. And those resources are starting to dwindle. The largest accumulation of phosphate rock resources is in some of the more geopolitically unstable parts of the world. And this is a particular interest and focusing the mind in Europe because we have no indigenous phosphate rock resources. And of course, phosphorus is vital for growing our crops, but inefficiencies in our use of phosphorus have resulted in large-scale water quality impairment. And this simultaneous dilemma of an overabundance of phosphorus getting into our water resources and the prospect of future phosphorus scarcity with growing populations and the need to feed people in terms of the growing demographics has been coined as the phosphorus paradox, this simultaneous overabundance and scarcity. And this is something which is of particular interest. And really, my research is targeted to what is increasingly becoming a societal grand challenge. How do we achieve food, water, and energy security for growing populations under increasing pressure from climate change without impairing the quality and ecological status of our water resources? So my research is very much targeted towards improving our stewardship of nutrients for sustainable management of water resources. And I'm going to talk to you about three main areas in which I'm working. The first is identifying the sources of phosphorus and nitrogen in watersheds so that we can target mitigation more effectively. The second is what we call the functional integrity of rivers and watersheds. These are the biogeochemical processes which confer resilience to external stressors, environmental change, and resilience to perturbation. And the third aspect is the drivers of eutrophication, the transitions from nutrient limitation to nutrient impairment of our waters. And today I'm going to talk about a couple of long-term, large-scale drivers in relation to the legacy of nutrients in our watersheds and also some of the global challenges we face in relation to nutrient sustainability. And of course, these three aspects are very much placed within the context of climate change, population growth, agricultural intensification, and how we can develop management strategies, adaptive management, to enable us to improve water quality and at the same time minimize the trade-offs and maximize the benefits for water, food, and phosphorus security. So in terms of nutrient sources, I suppose in some ways I come from a little bit of a different direction from what is traditionally done in terms of nutrient source determination. A lot of work is done at the plot and field scales, looking at runoff of sources from agricultural land. But I take a little bit of a downstream approach, being a river water chemist. What I'm interested in is looking at the dynamic fingerprints of water chemistry and how we can use that information to identify the sources of water and nutrients in watersheds. And I'm going to talk about two studies today. The first, Roy alluded to, is some work that I've been doing in the western basin of Lake Erie, and you'll be more than aware that over the last decade or more, there's been an increase in the magnitude and frequency of nuisance and harmful algal blooms in the western basin. So I've been working on some of the rivers draining into the western basin of Lake Erie. And the second is in the Illinois River watershed on the state line between Arkansas and Oklahoma. And northwest Arkansas, which is where I went to do my Fulbright fellowship, is a big poultry producing area. And of course, chickens produce a lot of pea-rich poop, which is applied to the pasture land to improve the pasture for beef production. So there's been an agricultural system that's built up around the integration of poultry and beef production. But the rivers in northwest Arkansas, and the Illinois River in particular, drains the poultry-producing areas of northwest Arkansas and flows over the state line into Oklahoma, where it feeds the drinking water reservoirs. And perhaps unsurprisingly, over the years, there have been a number of disputes and lawsuits between downstream water users and upstream land managers surrounding phosphorus. And this, in fact, went all the way to the US Supreme Court. So between these two examples, there are a few places in the world where phosphorus has received so much scrutiny. So one of the first things that I did when looking at the data for the the rivers draining into western Lake Erie Basin, was to plot up the cumulative soluble phosphorus fluxes. Now, the soluble phosphorus fluxes are of particular interest because although as a result of conservation activities, total phosphorus loads have gone down in the rivers going into the western Lake Erie Basin, there's been concern that soluble phosphorus is having an effect in particular. And so looking at these cumulative flux profiles is quite valuable because what we can start to look at is changes in the gradient of flux accumulation. And if you're just looking at the concentrations or fluxes of phosphorus in these non-point dominated rivers, you see big spikes coming through during rainfall events, and it's quite difficult to look at trends. But when we consider the cumulative flux, we can start to pick out some changes in the flux gradient. And the first one is a change that occurred in the early to mid-1980s. Prior to that, there was relatively steep accumulation of soluble phosphorus, and then a levelling off. And of course, at that time, the implementation of the Clean Water Act, reducing wastewater effluent discharges, part of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, followed by reductions in fertiliser applications, clearly had an impact on a levelling off, a reduction in the gradient of the soluble phosphorus flux accumulation. But then, in the early 2000s, something else changed, and there was a marked change in the accumulation of soluble reactive phosphorus going into the western basin of Lake Erie. Just plotted up the data of the Sandusky River, but the same pattern is seen right across the region in the Maumee River and the Raisin River. All of them start to see an upturn in soluble phosphorus coming through the system in the early 2000s. And so what I was really interested in was to look at what might have been occurring around this time that could explain this change in the system, which is correlated very well with the re-eutrophication, as known, of the western basin of Lake Erie. And one hypothesis is it's a result of climate change and an increase in the rainfall and runoff coming from these western Lake Erie catchments. But when we look at the water flux coming through, any changes in the cumulative plot of water are much more subtle. Which suggests that there is something else occurring, which is increasing the availability and the delivery of the soluble labile phosphorus fractions. And so to look in this more detail, to quantify and identify the effects of changes in runoff, we did some simple empirical modelling, and what we found was that around 35% of that increase in soluble P loads after 2002 could be attributed to higher runoff volumes. But the more significant factor was that 65% was arising from an enhancement of the delivery of these labile phosphorus fractions. And so the first thing to do after that was to actually consider the overall phosphorus budgets of these watersheds. And when we did that, we discovered that actually in all of these major rivers draining into the western basin of Lake Erie, there's actually been a net drawdown in phosphorus stores since the late 1990s. So the soluble phosphorus delivery was increasing after 2002, despite the fact that there was actually less phosphorus in the system. Now, another thing that has been occurring within the western Lake Erie Basin has been the introduction of conservation or reduced tillage. And this was brought in for erosion control, and it actually was incredibly effective. And conservation tillage is where you leave the stubble from the previous year's crop on the land over the winter period. It provides protection, a reduction in soil loss and erosion, and also particulate phosphorus that goes with that. And then you plant the new crop through the previous year's stubble. And actually, there was since the early 1990s, a very dramatic rise in the uptake of conservation tillage right across the western Lake Erie Basin. And this has had a major impact in terms of sediment loss. But there wasn't anything that particularly occurred in the early 2000s. It's just a general increase in the uptake of conservation tillage. But in terms of the soluble phosphorus fractions, it's actually well known that conservation tillage can actually promote soil stratification. And with the application of fertilizers, there wasn't really much change in the way that the fertilizers were applied. They were broadcast over the soil surface. And this can actually result in the accumulation of the fertilizer phosphorus, the highly available phosphorus fractions at the soil surface. The other thing about conservation tillage is it's really effective at improving soil health, which means that you get lots of macropores opening up, earthworm burrows. But of course, those provide a preferential flow pathway through the soil to the underlying drainage system. And so what we think perhaps has been happening is that the long-term uptake of conservation tillage may have resulted in a transition from the surface soil being a sink for phosphorus to a source of phosphorus to the underlying drainage waters. And in fact, there has been a widespread increase in tile drainage in these watersheds. Unfortunately, drainage is not something which is routinely recorded, and so there aren't data sets widely available for these watersheds to quantify the uptake in underlying subsurface tile drainage, other than, of course, a lot of anecdotal evidence and lots of people willing to tell you that these systems have been completely plumbed up since particularly in the 1990s. And of course, again, it's a valuable way of reducing surface runoff and erosion, so had been recommended in terms of a beneficial management practice. What we were able to show was that there were some changes in hydrology. They were relatively small, but we saw about a 15% increase in the flashiness, which could be attributed to the accelerated delivery of surface accumulated phosphorus going from the land to the river. But there was nothing that happened at any point in time around the 2000-2002 period to which we could attribute this sudden upturn in the delivery of soluble phosphorus. And what we believe is most likely happening is that there's been a cumulative and converging effect of an increase in the availability of labile phosphorus right at the soil surface, and then an increase in the transport via macropores and into the tile drainage system, which coming together increases what we call the critical source area, the areas which are in hydrological connectivity to the stream channel where there's a source of phosphorus available to be mobilized. And most likely what's happened is that there's been a convergence of these factors, potentially reaching a critical threshold of soluble phosphorus delivery around 2002. And so the lessons learned from this work was everything that had been done in these watersheds was the recommended practices. There were no bad guys in this. The farmers had been doing what had been recommended. But perhaps with hindsight, we might have seen that there could have been unintended consequences of changing these farming practices together. And the convergence of these effects may well have been responsible for that upturn in soluble phosphorus. And really, that effective conservation is an adaptive process, and the importance of monitoring to see where changes start to occur and where some of these trade-offs and unintended consequences can occur. And as Roy said, we were delighted to have the paper selected for Best Paper 2018. And so that was a nice piece of work, bringing together a range of expertise and particularly a lot of very detailed data. So the second example that I wanted to talk to you about is some work on the Illinois River. As I mentioned before, one of the things that I'm interested in is not just measuring nitrogen and phosphorus, but measuring a whole suite of chemicals and using tracers of water sources. And some very simple techniques like M-member mixing to enable us to identify the sources of nitrogen and phosphorus in watersheds. And this is an example where we were able to use chloride as a conservative tracer of wastewater effluent. And what we found was that actually these rivers in northwest Arkansas were incredibly efficient at taking up phosphorus from the wastewater effluent. And using these simple mixing models, we were able to quantify how much phosphorus was coming in the river from sewage treatment effluent and the dilution effect with increasing river flows, and then compared that with what we're actually measuring in the stream. And we could therefore quantify how much phosphorus had been retained, and then how much of that retained phosphorus was contributing to the fluxes under high flow conditions. And what we found was around 50% of the total flux being delivered during these storm events was derived from the effluent phosphorus that had been stored in the river under low flow conditions. And of course, the high flow fluxes were almost entirely attributed to the poultry litter applications and non-point source contributions. So this study provided a very important information about why we should be accounting for some of these in-stream processes of phosphorus retention and remobilisation. Because if we don't, we can actually risk overestimating the importance of agricultural sources and underestimating the wastewater sources. And this is really important in getting the balance right, in attributing nutrient source contributions and for the effective targeting of our mitigation measures. And the paper was published in ES&T. So secondly, the second thing that I wanted to talk about is this capacity of rivers to buffer the input, the biogeochemical processes. So we just talked a little bit about phosphorus retention in the stream system, but there are a wide range of biogeochemical processes which can retain nutrients. This provides a really important ecosystem service in protecting downstream aquatic ecosystems from acute nutrient loadings. And this really contributes to this functional integrity of rivers and watersheds. And one of the things that I've been very interested in doing is how we can exploit new in situ monitoring technologies of nutrients and other chemistry by taking the lab into the field and using these to start to understand some of the processes that are occurring. And what I'm interested in doing is coupling the in situ nitrogen and phosphorus monitoring with some of the measurements of dissolved oxygen, which we can use to calculate stream metabolism, so the rates of photosynthesis and respiration, and the ecological processes that are occurring in river systems. And this is just an example of some work that I did again in Arkansas along an experimental river reach, which is subject to inputs from a concentrated animal feeding operation. This time not poultry, but pigs. And what we did was we had a reach that we monitored upstream and downstream with some high resolution nitrate monitoring. And the first thing is this graph showing the relationship between the upstream nitrate concentrations and the downstream nitrate concentrations. And these I've just plotted up the daily average here. But what we can see is that there's quite a big seasonal change. So during the period from December to July, we saw, well, a good relationship, almost a one-to-one relationship between the upstream nitrate concentration and the downstream nitrate concentration. However, something changed in mid-July, and you see a very different pattern here. And here you see a much wider range in the concentrations in the upstream monitoring site, which is receiving some effluent inputs from the hog farm. but a much more restricted range in the concentrations at the downstream sites. And when we looked at the mass balance in this period between July and November, between 30 and 90% of the nitrogen load along this experimental river reach was removed. And by linking the nitrate measurements with the dissolved oxygen, where we calculated the rates of respiration and photosynthesis, we could calculate how much nitrogen was being taken up by primary production, by the benthic algae, to derive, and by comparing that with the mass balance along the reach, taking the difference between how much nitrate was being lost along the reach to the uptake by the photosynthesizing plants, we could determine whether you were getting net nitrification, where organic matter is being broken down to release nitrate, or denitrification, where the nitrate is being lost and you're getting nitrogen dioxide or nitrogen gas disappearing into the atmosphere. And what we found was that this switch to higher rates of nitrogen removal corresponded with a very marked change. Firstly, a switch from assimilatory nitrate uptake by the photosynthesizing plants to denitrification and the microbial processes which are releasing nitrogen gas into the atmosphere. And secondly, in stream metabolism, we saw a switch from a stream system that was net autotrophic, so dominated by photosynthesis, to net heterotrophic. And what this is telling us that the nutrient buffering capacity in these stream systems is very much driven by seasonal patterns and shifts in metabolic pathways. And so I'm particularly interested in the role of headwater streams in aquatic ecosystem function, and particularly this buffering capacity. And of course, headwater streams provide a critical interface between the land and the water for the transport of sediment, nutrients and water. Because they're small stream systems, they have a relatively low dilution capacity, and so they're very sensitive to anthropogenic inputs, and they're also hotspots of nutrient and organic matter processing. And so we hypothesize that they are providing a vital role in transforming, regulating the delivery of nutrients coming in from the land system to the downstream river systems. And so looking at the effects of changing land use on headwater stream metabolism is of great interest. And of course, nowadays, many more people are measuring dissolved oxygen at high frequency right around the world. And so as I knew I was coming here to Ontario, I had a little look to see what sort of data sets are being collected here in the Grand River watershed by the Conservation Authority. And there are a couple of little gems came out from this. So what I did was I ran the dissolved oxygen data through, I've got a model for calculating rates of photosynthesis and respiration. And one headwater stream that's monitored is a stream called Blair Creek. Some of you may be familiar with this. And I looked at the reports, and one of the reasons this stream was being monitored was that there's been a marked change in the land use. So it was a rural headwater, and in 2011, the residential development began. And what we see here is a really marked change. So prior to about 2012-13, you see big seasonal changes in respiration rates. But after 2012, 2013, there's been a real dampening down of these respiration rates. And one might hypothesize that the clearance of trees and vegetation has reduced the organic matter leaf litter inputs to the stream system. And what you see is that the photosynthesis rates don't really change, but a real switch from a stream system that was entirely heterotrophic dominated to one that was an autotrophic photosynthetic algae dominated system. And this of course has big implications for nutrient cycling. So a lovely example right here on your doorstep of changes in respiration rates and stream metabolism linked to land use change. And the second thing was comparing the headwater stream Blair Creek with the main stem of the Grand River. And for this, I've looked at the primary production, the gross primary production, the rates of photosynthesis. And the really nice thing that pops out here is, of course, that you're getting vastly higher rates of photosynthesis in your headwater stream systems compared with the main stem of the Grand River. And it's really demonstrating the importance of some of these biological processes in the headwaters. And by coupling this understanding of biological processes and nutrient cycling, I think there's great potential here for looking at the controls that biological processes play on the fluxes of nutrients being transmitted right along that continuum between the land and the lake. So the third example that I wanted to talk to you today about were these drivers of eutrophication. And of course, eutrophication is a major cause of water quality impairment right across the world. And we face a bit of an inconvenient truth here that despite decades of conservation and mitigation measures, we have not always seen the improvements on the timescales that have been expected in terms of our water quality modelers and what our stakeholders and catchment managers were hoping to achieve. And today I want to just talk about two aspects of the kind of drivers of eutrophication in relation to this. Firstly, in relation to legacy phosphorus, the storage of nutrients in our watersheds and their release over longer timescales, but also the fragmentation and breakdown in the phosphorus cycle at local, regional, and even global levels. So in terms of legacy phosphorus, one of the major issues is a delayed response to mitigation measures. And this is an example from Loch Leven in Scotland, where there was a dramatic reduction in phosphorus inputs in the 1990s as a result of improvements in wastewater treatment, a 60% reduction. But it took around 10 to 15 years to see an improvement in terms of meeting water quality targets in the lake itself. And of course, this is to do with the storage and the recycling of legacy phosphorus in the bed sediments. And we've done quite a bit of work looking at the likely legacy phosphorus storage timescales in our catchment systems, which may range from a year or less in some rapidly mobilizing in-channel systems, to years to decades in our soil and groundwater systems and lake systems, to in longer sedimentary stores like riparian areas and floodplains can run into centuries. And of course, whilst these processes provide some kind of resilience to acute loadings moving through the system, the concern is that the chronic release, low-level release of nutrients from these legacy stores may well mean a longer wait than we might have expected to see those kind of downstream water quality improvements. And we've published some papers looking at the phosphorus legacy work, and know that here in Waterloo there's been fantastic work being done by Nandita and Philippe and colleagues on these issues. And one of the real challenges that we have is looking at the historical records. And probably the River Thames in southeast England is one of the few places in the world where we do have a very extensive record going back 80 years. Phosphorus was, they started measuring phosphorus back in 1936. And what we've done is to construct a phosphorus balance for the Thames watershed going back to 1936. So calculating all the inputs in fertilizer, feed, food, industrial products, losses in terms of crop uptake, export, losses via the river system. And we see these kind of patterns. So there was a rapid, so the red line here shows the cumulative phosphorus balance. It was a relatively rapid increase in the post-war years with the dig for victory and the application of phosphorus fertilizer to maximize the yields. And then by the mid-1970s, it starts to flatten off as the inputs and the outputs start to converge. And then by the time you reach the early 2000s, things have just started to level off and started to move from the phosphorus, the River Thames catchment being a phosphorus sink to a source and a drawdown in the accumulation of phosphorus in the watershed. And so what we found from this work, and we did some work on some other rivers, the Yangtze in China and the Maumee River, actually draining into Lake Erie, but what we found was in the Thames, the accumulation and drawdown of legacy phosphorus in these watersheds is directly linked to the food production and consumption, imports and exports of fertilizer, feed, crop and livestock products, and urbanization. And so this was part of a much larger study looking at a range of river types, and of course in the Yangtze in China they're on the accumulation phase, and the Maumee is similar to the Thames and things in that you just entered a phase of drawdown. But what this is really showing is that our phosphorus budgets in our watersheds are linked to much wider global scale patterns and processes. And the historical successes in redistributing phosphorus as fertilizer has been the foundation, of course, of all modern agricultural systems, the improvements in yields, and this has really supported the transition to modern and urbanized societies. But of course, despite the successes that we've had in distributing phosphorus around the globe, there are still profound inequalities. Of course, the phosphorus surpluses that we see are in places like North America, Brazil, China, Europe, and these are very much linked to the water quality impairment. But we still see phosphorus deficits. Around 30% of global cropland is deficient in phosphorus, and of course this is very much linked to the locations where we see poverty and food insecurity. And in our attempts to improve and optimize farming and improve the distribution of phosphorus, we've actually transformed the face of farming. So whereas in the past we had mixed livestock and crop farming where the manure from the livestock was recycled back to the land to improve to fertilize the fields, this has very much given way to a much more industrial scale farming, which is completely dependent on the imports of large-scale rock phosphate, inorganic fertilizer transfers from those mineral reserves to the very geographically distinct areas of grain and livestock production. The United States, of course, is a very good example for this. You have the accumulation, you have the concentration of grain production in the Midwest and the Mississippi Valley, and then you have different locations of specialist livestock production. And of course, what this means is you have an overaccumulation of phosphorus in the areas where the animals are being produced, and they're hundreds of miles away from where the grain is produced, and of course it's too costly to recycle it by transporting it back. And this is very nicely demonstrated where the phosphorus production, not just by animals, by humans, we produce a lot of phosphorus waste, is juxtaposed by the areas of phosphorus demand of fertilizer. And of course, as you say, along the Midwest, the Mississippi Valley, dependent on the inputs of fertilizer. And then you have these geographically distinct areas, the cities and the big livestock production areas. And this, of course, has caused the widespread breakdown in our phosphorus cycle. Large transfer distances have precluded the movement of phosphorus back to the areas of grain production. And this, of course, has just simply increased our dependence on inorganic fertilizers and reduced the efficiency of phosphorus use, which, of course, impairs water quality and is a major threat to our water security. And this, of course, a local example is a very good example of this. And we face really a big challenge because, of course, going back to the soluble phosphorus inputs to Lake Erie, those increases in soluble phosphorus, which are linked to these nuisance and toxic algal blooms, actually only represent about 5% of the annual phosphorus applied in these watersheds. And so the big question is, of course, how do we promote sustainable agricultural management when the cost of these losses of phosphorus are so low in agronomic terms? And of course, this is a big challenge, a societal challenge, and of course will require a much wider appreciation that phosphorus is a non-renewable limiting resource. And what we will need is an appreciation that we need a collaboration right across the food chain, from farm to fork to wastewater treatment plant, in improving the synergies to improve the societal efficiency of phosphorus right along that scale as part of this kind of nexus of water, food and energy security. And of course there are some big challenges in relation to improving our soil, land and water management, recovering and recycling of phosphorus. I mean, there's a lot of work going on, particularly in Europe at the moment, on recovery technologies and how we can reconnect our broken phosphorus cycle by converting that waste phosphorus in animal manures and human waste and sewage biosolids to produce an agricultural fertilizers which can be transported back cheaply and easily to the areas where we're growing our crops to reconnect our broken phosphorus cycle. And more generally, a wider appreciation that we need better phosphorus governance right across the food system. So just concluding, I think this is a very exciting time for research in eutrophication, water quality and nutrient sustainability in relation to water resources management. But of course, the real challenges that we face are that we can no longer look at water quality in isolation. The challenges that we face with increasing environmental change will require us to have much more cross-disciplinary interaction, and this involves bringing together understanding of changes in urban and agricultural and rural systems in relation to climate change and the impacts on water and nutrient cycles, finding ways of adapting our management so that we minimize those unintended consequences and the trade-offs and maximize the benefits between water, food and nutrient security. And finally, finding those solutions which are working with our stakeholders, which address not just environmental but human health and well-being. And of course, what this involves is really making sure that we're integrating our water quality, water security science with the socioeconomics and some of these institutional challenges for water and nutrient management and governance. So having spent a couple of days talking with the faculty and students here at the University of Waterloo, I would say that you're in an ideal position with your geographical location at the heart of the Southern Great Lakes, and your network of interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary expertise. So this is just a final picture of one of the residents of the River Thames in Wallingford beside my research institute. Thank you.
This is a very appropriate presentation, excellent presentation, thank you very much. Because it's 350 years since phosphorus was discovered, as you may know, by a German alchemist,
Yes.
1669, I believe. Anyone knows how he accidentally discovered it? No? No one has a clue? So he was looking for the philosopher's stone and trying to make gold out of lead, and he used human urine for two reasons. One, urine resembles the color of gold, and the second one was it came from the human body, which he considered was perfect. So we got 15 minutes for questions. After this fun fact, anyone who wants to kick off the
So I guess
the discussion.
The fact is that we are still trying to find ways of recovering phosphorus from human waste 350 years later.
Yes. Anyone at the back? Chris.
Thanks, that was a great presentation. Do you think there'll be a large-scale shift in our diets from a very heavy meat-based diet that we have currently in North America to potentially a vegan or vegetarian diet based on phosphorus limitation?
Certainly, the livestock production is particularly inefficient in phosphorus use. And so, yes, and in fact, when you go along to some of the phosphorus sustainability workshops, they move us over to a vegetarian diet sometimes in demonstrating that animal agriculture is not an efficient way of producing food for a rapidly expanding population. But of course, there are a myriad of issues around that, and of course an increase in demand in the developing countries for protein-rich diets. So there are all sorts of ethical issues around prescribing what should happen in terms of human diets. I think our focus is very much on how we can make the agricultural system more efficient, and taking into account the fact that people will continue to want to have meat and dairy in their diets, but perhaps a balanced approach which will involve, recommendations of reductions in meat consumption, not just for resource sustainability issues, but also for human health issues as well. So I think, from my point of view, I think in our lifetime, I think it's unlikely that we will see a move completely over to vegetarian diets, but a balanced approach with a reduction, particularly in the Western world, of meat consumption, but with a much more a rigorous approach to how we can improve the sustainability of our farming systems, but also the waste management from cities as well. So there are many opportunities there. The challenge, of course, is an economic one, because at the moment the cost of fertilizer is relatively cheap. Now, back in 2008, there was a big price spike in phosphorus fertilizer. Many reasons for that associated with the oil crisis and various things, but that had a big impact on how farmers were using phosphorus, and also a recognition that, of course, there are big legacy stores of phosphorus in the system. So there are a myriad of issues surrounding the issue of diets, but I take your point, and it's one well made, that there is inefficiency in our animal production.
Who else?
Thank you for the talk. So there's other rivers where we see a decrease in total phosphorus, an increase in soluble phosphorus. Yeah. And one of the hypotheses is that because of land conservation, you have less sediment load into the rivers, therefore less absorption sites for the soluble phosphorus, so that essentially it's the retention capacity of the river that is for soluble phosphorus that is decreased. So how do you distinguish between those mechanisms, the in-stream mechanisms, versus the source-based mechanisms?
Yes, I mean, that is a very good point, and it's one that we did a little bit of work looking at the KDs of soluble phosphorus absorption in the river systems. There has been a reduction in suspended sediment loads. Hasn't been a dramatic reduction. So I think the jury's still out, and certainly in-stream processes could provide an important component. I think that, so there's definitely more work to be done in this area. Yeah.
Really interesting talk, Helen.
Thank you.
Loved it. I had a quick question. So when you were looking at the upstream, downstream analysis, how did you account for lateral fluxes within that reach? Was that separately?
Okay, so we had we did a water mass balance along the reach, so we were able to determine whether there were any significant increases along the reach, and so we did account for any of those. I mean, one of the more challenges were not necessarily lateral, but coming in from the river bed, because this is a karstic region.
Okay.
And so we did do some work and also looked at the CO2 level, so you could actually see where the inflow of water was coming through. But we did account for that on the mass balance, yeah.
Thank you.
More questions?
I had a question about the same study. I thought it was really interesting that you said that you had a pretty clean break between a net autotrophic and a net heterotrophic regime. And I was wondering if that's related at all to changes in the discharge regime over that time. Did you go from like a scouring flow regime to a non-scouring regime?
No, it was actually going to a very low flow regime where a higher proportion of the flow was actually flowing through the hyporheic zone under the river, and of course there you have a lot of organic matter accumulated, so that's where you start to see a change from the net autotrophy to heterotrophy, where you've got all the breakdown of organic matter and a higher component of the flow going through that hyporheic zone. And I think that's where a lot of the denitrification is occurring.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the great talk. I enjoyed it very much. And I have two questions. One question is regarding this autotrophic, heterotrophic production in streams and rivers. Do you think what kind of uncertainties in those estimates? Because so much depends on the gas exchange between water and between atmosphere. And the second question, also, like, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding that, like, in the United States, I was, like, here, like, lots of agricultural, like, practices and other for the farmers, they are voluntary. And the land is very often going from one hands to another hands, especially in Ontario. Those farming lands probably will change in 50 years, like 100%. So in this case, do you think that we will see maybe more stricter like policies, like more enforced policies towards like farmers, how to use, like when to use the fertilizer? And the second, maybe perhaps like a special tax for phosphorus, so to make it more expensive, so it's maybe more expensive for farmers to use, so they will be more efficient, and maybe to facilitate those like development of the technologies to extract the phosphorus from those.
Okay, so I'll take the question about the uncertainty in the stream metabolism measurements. So in the model that we use to calculate net respiration and photosynthesis, we use an empirical means of estimating the re-aeration rate, and I think this was what you were referring to. There can be quite a lot of variability in re-aeration rate. We didn't actually measure re-aeration rate, but what we use is the time difference between the solar noon and the peak in dissolved oxygen concentration, and that there's a lot of work that's been done to show that that is correlated to the re-aeration rate. So that's what we use. I would take your point that there will be uncertainty in that, but what we see is in terms of seasonal patterns, very consistent changes between between net photosynthesis and net respiration. So I'm sure there's some uncertainty in there related to some of those processes of gaseous exchange, but that's clearly overwhelmed by the biological controls that are going on within the system. But it would be interesting, and some colleagues have been doing some work calculating the actual re-aeration rate, and there has been some cross-comparison on that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And, depending on whether you've got turbulent flow and all of that sort of thing. So, yeah, point very well made. In relation to management practices, I'm not very familiar with the situation here in Ontario. Certainly in the UK, there has been very much a move to use voluntary measures in the first instance, and that is to engage farmers in best management practices by having effectively extension representatives going out and talking with farmers. We don't in the UK require soil testing, but there is a move to encourage farmers, rather using the carrot rather than the stick. I'm not sure that that has been demonstrated to have had great impact in terms of water quality, and of course many farmers use phosphorus fertilizer as a bit of an insurance policy to because they think there's the best chance of maximizing their yields. But yes, there's the threat of regulation is an option. But it's not something that we've gone down, a route that we've gone down in the UK. Yeah.
No one? And let's give Helen another round of applause, please.
Thank you.